When it comes to Beach Boys albums, everybody has their favorites and their least favorites, but there are also a few that have kind of fallen into the cracks that really aren't discussed. The first major failure and the first black sheep of the Beach Boys family was their 1968 failure, Stacco tracks, the original backing tracks to several of their popular songs, some hit singles, some album cuts. But this album, which I find it very difficult to classify exactly what it is. I guess a remix album is the closest you could get. But the point is, this album didn't really resonate with fans. It was quickly removed from the catalog and is kind of just a neat curio that's lost to time. I want to look at another kind of unusual curio today. One that has also been lost to time, even though we've discussed it numerous times on this channel. From 1983, Beach Boys Rarities. I've been promising this video for a while. It's time we finally got there. The sleeve of mine, of course, as you can see, is quite a bit beat up, but the record itself plays fine. I thought we really need to talk about this today, because there's a lot of unusual stuff here on the Rarities album. Rarities, again from 1983, wasn't the first time the Beach Boys fans could get rare archival, previously unreleased material. In 1981, 10 Years of Harmony had been released, and 10 Years of Harmony featured several previously unreleased or very rare tracks. Let the motorcycles go by there. But Rarities would be sort of the second time the fans could do that. And Rarities had a lot more in terms of unreleased and extremely rare material than 10 Years of Harmony had. That was more of a both career retrospective and also greatest hits package. I have a whole two-part video series on 10 Years of Harmony. Quite a bit to unpack there. So Rarities isn't really focused on anything. It's kind of a random collection of Beach Boys stuff. And I think this is why a set like this wouldn't really work today. Most of our more modern collections and compilations tend to have, you know, a focus, a theme, certain songs or certain types of songs. Rarities is a little bit of everything. It was not particularly successful in its day either. It was very quickly pulled from store shelves, didn't really seem to sell that well or generate much of a following. Brad Elliott, the man who compiled the album, has a whole website devoted to this album and its history, which I will link below for you. But he noted that there was a lot of legal wrangling involved. You might remember when we talked about albums like Spirit of America and Sunshine Dream, that the Beach Boys had broken with Capitol Records. But even before that break, they'd established Brother Records. And at some point, ownership of all their late 60s albums, Pet Sounds, Smiley Smile, Friends, 2020, everything from that era that was on an LP had reverted to their ownership. But interestingly enough, songs that were recorded during that time but not released on one of those albums would remain Capitol's possession. So there's this bizarre, you know, what's Brother Records and what's Capitol Records, this kind of weird push-pull thing going on. And judging by some of Mike Love's comments at the time, it was a pretty acrimonious split. I say that because Brad Elliott blames that for this album's failure, claiming that he had gotten permission from Capitol to use these songs, but not from the Beach Boys camp. And as some of them were outtakes, I guess the Beach Boys had a say in that. I mean, Brad Elliott said he thought he just needed Capitol's permission, but apparently he needed the Beach Boys group permission as well. Seems like a weird kind of gray area, but I get where he's coming from with that. You know, we'll talk about the Capitol reissue albums here, probably in June, and look at some of those and get more into the meat of exactly what was going on with all that situation. Seems like a lot of legalese, and who knows, you know, at the end of the day, what actually happened with a lot of these. But the point is, Rarities was kind of having difficulty from the start due to all these confusing legal bits going on. Alright, also I should add, everything on Rarities is indeed available today, at least in the broad strokes. We'll get more into that when we do the track list. Rarities comes with this very cool insert, which I'll leave this picture collage up here for a moment. And on the back, the liner notes, complete with an outtake from the Stacco Tracks photo. That website has a complete liner notes for you, as well as liner notes for the unused song, which we'll get into that later in the video as well. But that's a really nice picture collage, though. Pretty fun. Speaking of artwork, I guess we might as well talk about it now. The cover, which is, yeah, that is definitely something. It's not the first time we've seen cheesecake or even beefcake photos to try to sell Beach Boys stuff. The Pickwick Surfer Girl album notably uses girls in bathing suits. The Beach Boys did their famous photo shoot at Zuma Beach in the late 60s where they're shirtless and arm wrestling and doing gymnastics and things like that. Anything to try to sell them as sex symbols. And while this cover definitely evokes beach nostalgia, I feel like this cover was catered very much to the teenage boy market at the time. I don't necessarily hate this cover for being a bit too bare for my taste, but what bothers me is this cover has nothing in common with the music on the record. This doesn't exactly scream Auld Lang Syne or Celebrate the News or The Lord's Prayer. You know, I don't know. I think if they had done kind of a beach tune compilation and used this image, it wouldn't have mattered. And indeed, Capitol would repurpose this image later in the 80s for their California and Other Girls, cassette tape, which featured songs with girls' names in the titles, or the word girl in title, or love songs. And it actually works here. I think it's a suitable cover image. There are also some foreign pressings that have the girl, she's wearing like a red shirt over top, you know, just to eliminate any issues with lewdness on record covers. But yeah, certainly, I'm sure people who didn't know anything about the Beach Boys bought that record just to have that with their Playboy collections, I suppose. Should also be noted that while Rarities was released to vinyl and CD, or vinyl and cassette, it was only released to CD in Japan. And you can buy those Japanese CDs, but they are pretty expensive, so keep that in mind. So it did get a CD release, but not in the US. And I believe all the Japanese CD versions are discontinued. They came with the Beach Boys medley and some of the other less popular medley tracks, all of which you can find on other releases. We'll talk about those someday. But that was how they chose to release them there. So, pretty interesting stuff. Alright, we went over the cover, the legal issues. Let's talk music. Now again, everything on Rarities is available elsewhere in today's market. Some you have to look a little harder for, some there's a little bit of hair splitting, but for the most part you can indeed find everything. So Rarities begins with two outtakes from Laid in Hawaii. We've talked about Laid in Hawaii quite a bit before. We talked about both the actual Hawaiian concerts and the in-studio shows they were doing to kind of replace those actual concerts. And all of Laid in Hawaii, including these two songs, eventually released in 2017 on Sunshine Tomorrow. And this actually featured alternate takes of the Laid in Hawaii songs on this album, which include a cover of the Beatles with little help from my friends, and a cover of the Box Tops' The Letter. Makes for a good start, I would say. Both of which very unique, with these kind of very vocal-heavy, stripped-down versions. Interestingly enough, an obscure release we've talked about before from 2006 called Covered by the Beach Boys featured both of these making their CD debut. So a lot of people had to wait, if they bought this record and wanted these songs on CD, you only had to wait 23 years to actually be able to get them. And you can get the nicer, more up-to-date versions here on Sunshine Tomorrow from 2017. And The Letter is also used on the Made in California set as well. But at the end of the day, kind of a good place to start too. Songs that we really hadn't heard the Beach Boys do, songs that collectors wouldn't have at the moment. Good place to start. Speaking of Sunshine Tomorrow, our next song on there is the extended version of their, the Beach Boys cover of Stevie Wonder's I Was Made to Love Her. Now this version, up until 2017, so from 1983 to 2017, the only way to get this particular version of the song was on this record. The only difference between it and the Wild Honey version is how it has an a cappella middle bit, all through thick and thin, my love just won't end. It's a really fun addition to the song. I actually like that version better than the one that they finally decided to put on Wild Honey, but this was the main reason why a lot of people were hunting for this record throughout the 2000s and 2010s, to have this one alternate take that remained exclusive to it. And now, again, we have it right handy on Sunshine Tomorrow for you. So far everything is pretty themed around 1967, you know, that Wild Honey era stuff. But let's actually shift gears a little bit and get to the only Smile track on the album. So at this point in history, the only Smile songs we gotten were the ones that had sort of trickled down to other records, like Mama Says on Wild Honey, Surf's Up on that album, Surf's Up. In 1993, a decade after Rarities, the Good Vibrations box set made a big deal about including lots of Smile outtakes, and indeed that was the main selling feature. But in 1983, unless you had some bootlegs, there's really no way you're going to have Smile songs. But the one they chose for this record, You're Welcome, was actually the B-side to Heroes and Villains. I showed you that Heroes and Villains single earlier. You're Welcome was the B-side, this really complex, difficult, multi-layered song backed with a relatively simple vocal chant. So You're Welcome was technically available already if you had that single. In the 90s, it'd be a bonus track on the Smiley Smile Wild Honey pairing. And of course in 2011, when we started getting, actual proper Smile releases, here's the small box, of course there's also the big box and the vinyl, everything else like that, but You're Welcome's included here too. Interestingly, You're Welcome seems to be more of a bonus feature to Smile than it is part of the actual track list, but it's nice they included something from that era here, even though it wasn't something brand new. And I really like You're Welcome. It's actually one of my favorites from the Smile era. Just very simple, well, you're welcome, and it gets more complex as it goes. Interesting choice, and again, close enough to the other tracks that came before it that so far we're pretty cohesive. But we know that's not going to last, because next thing we do, take a detour back to 1963 for The Lord's Prayer. The Lord's Prayer was released as the B-side to their popular Christmas single, Little Saint Nick. But oddly enough, The Lord's Prayer never really caught on. It didn't chart, unlike Little Saint Nick. It wasn't in a live set or done on television or anything like that. They did tinker with doing it live. We talked about that when we talked about Live Sunshine. But for the most part, it was just kind of a forgotten B-side. And this is not helped by the fact that most Christmas album reissues and expansions don't include it. It's usually ignored in favor of more, I guess, directly Christmassy songs. So I think only the first CD printing of Little Saint Nick, or I should say the Christmas album, excuse me, features it, along with bonus tracks, like alternate takes of Little Saint Nick. But an interesting choice here. I don't think it quite fits with the songs that came before it. It's nice to have an a cappella, I guess. I can see why you might be able to kind of connect You're Welcome and The Lord's Prayer together, that you kind of go together, I guess. But we're starting to get off into weird territory here and things that you wouldn't expect. But also a B-side, something that if you were collected singles, you probably would have had it. Next up, we get to the weirdest one, and the one you can blame for this video not having been done last summer, as I promised, the Dutch version of Bluebirds Over the Mountain. I could not get my hands on another release that had this. I ordered a CD called the Dutch Singles Collection, and when I got the disc in the mail, it was the wrong CD, and that was a whole mess with Amazon. And I finally found the cheapest alternative was to buy an original 1968 single copy from the Netherlands and have it shipped over. So this is kind of an odd one, because Bluebirds Over the Mountain was released worldwide, but in Holland it was remixed so that the backing instrumentation was up to about the same level as the vocals. So occasionally we hear these really loud percussions going bunk, 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 or a strum guitar coming in from nowhere. It's a really weird remix. I don't quite know what the story is. The liner notes claim it was mostly an accident, and I guess maybe it was, but it must have resonated with Dutch audiences at the time because Bluebirds Over the Mountain was very successful there. So here we have a song that we've heard before, but remixed in a new way. Long before that was a popular thing. Of course, Bluebirds Over the Mountain, you can find the original version on many releases. I do need to note, in case anyone is confused, the 2018 set, I Can Hear Music, does not include this particular version. It remains exclusive to the Rarities album, be it on cassette, CD, wherever you find it, if you want to fork out for the Japanese one, the original single, and that Dutch singles release. But other than that, pretty rare stuff. That's the rarest one to find on this album if you're trying to piece it together instead of just purchasing this. Our last one for side A, Celebrate the News. Celebrate the News was the B-side to Breakaway. Remember, Breakaway was a non-album single. It hadn't been a huge success in the US, but it was more successful elsewhere. Celebrate the News didn't chart, Today it's probably most noted for Dennis saying hello at the beginning of the song, which is always kind of funny, but it was released in a few places. Usually anywhere that celebrates Dennis in the late 60s, early 70s will feature it. It is a nice song. It was used on the big version of Feel Flows. It's not on the small version, but I wanted to have a visual to show you. Nice B-side, and one that's more popular today. We'll see a couple of these rarities aren't so rare anymore, but I like that it's here, and it brings a good closing to the first side. So we've started pretty cohesively, a few detours here and there, but now we're going to detour again, back to 1966, an alternate take of Good Vibrations. This is important to note because when this take was re-released on the Good Vibrations 12-inch single, they actually promoted it as a previously unreleased version. So apparently they thought so few people had bought rarities back in the day, it didn't really matter. They could say it was brand new. It's not a whole lot different. It's not quite like the early takes that use lyrics that were eventually altered or discarded. It's pretty close to it. Most of the differences are in like the chorus and whatnot. It's a neat alternate take, not really essential listening though. And then we go off the rails again for the oldest track on the album, but actually one of my favorites. An outtake from Surfin' Safari, we get Land Ahoy. The Beach Boys would return to Land Ahoy and rework it later on, and we'll talk about that when we get to some of their early 1963 albums. But Land Ahoy is neat to have, mostly because we don't have a lot of outtakes from this period. And I've always really liked it. It's a simple song. I've been overseas for almost a year, but it's fun. And it's a nice change of pace, I think, and kind of pulling way back in the group's career. And I think that's a neat idea. So, you might remember, if you're a Beatles aficionado, the Beatles did a few of their songs in German. Notably, She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand. They released these German language versions. They've popped up here and there over time. Our next song is the German version of In My Room, called Ganz Allein. And I could see this being one of the songs that maybe people were kind of hung up on with who actually owned it, as it was a weird outtake from early in their career. But it's neat to have it here. Ganz Allein musically follows the song very closely, might even be the original backing track for In My Room. But we have some kind of interesting vocal deliveries. The Beach Boys would experiment with singing in other languages with other songs too, like At My Window, Bells of Paris. Sumahama has a Japanese verse, and even Kokomo is re-recorded in Spanish. But while it makes sense for the Beatles to sing in German, as they had one of their big breakouts in Hamburg, the Beach Boys doing it, I don't really know what the reason was, besides maybe just trying to cash in on those Beatles ones. And although Brad Elliott says there are other songs of theirs they did in German, as far as I know, this is the only one, or the only one that's surfaced anyway. But you can find this on the Surfer Girl Shutdown Volume 2 2 CD pretty easily. Moving on, next we have probably the most common of these rarities, a little song that goes, When I was a little bitty baby, Mama done rocked me in a cradle. That would be Cotton Fields. Now you might say, why is Cotton Fields on the Rarities album? You can find Cotton Fields all over the place today. And indeed you can. But remember, Cotton Fields, when it had been released as a non-album single, didn't catch on in the US. The group was pushing it. Here's the Fillmore East concert where they did a live version and whatnot. But for the most part, Cotton Fields just didn't resonate. It was a big hit in Europe, almost topping the charts in some places. And of course many other artists were tinkering with it at the time too, such as Elton John, The Seekers, and so on. But what makes it interesting is that the US audience didn't really care for it, and not a lot of people bought the single, so it makes sense to include it here. Today, of course, you can get the mono version on the Good Vibrations set, and the stereo version was released in 2001 for Hawthorne, California. It's on pretty much every major box set. I should note the more recent versions, like from Feel Flows in the early 2020s, they are remixed pretty heavily. They have like a reverb intro and stuff. Cotton Fields had been on the 2020 album, but had been remixed for a single to make it more of a country rocker. And that's the version we have here. The most common of the rarities. Next up, we have All I Want to Do, Live in London. We've talked all about Live in London. I have a whole giant video on it. But the Beach Boys did a couple shows at the London Palladium which went unused, and they recorded their proper Live in London concert at Finsbury Park, Astoria. All I Want to Do was the only song I think they changed between the two shows that they didn't really want to do. That's kind of funny, isn't it? But All I Want to Do was part of the big closer. They did it at each London Palladium show. They really messed up the second show, so this uses the take from the first. I mean, the second show, Mike Love literally says in the middle of the song that they don't know what they're doing, they messed it up. But they used the second take here. This is only a piece of the performance. It's missing kind of the ending coda to the song. Brad Elliott says the machine ran out of tape. However, the digital versions, which you can find on the On Tour 1968-2018 digital release, they feature the complete song. The version on Made in California from 2013 says it's edited together from multiple performances, but this seems like a seamless edit. Maybe those tapes were misplaced and then found later. But it's the only live track here, and I guess picking the group's most sexual song to go with this cover is probably a wise idea. It feels a bit out of place being the only live track and coming after a lot of kind of simpler songs that aren't sexually charged or anything like that. But interesting stuff, and I like that we get this, and indeed we can find better versions of it later. But I guess if you were splitting hairs, you'd say, oh, the shortened edit is only available here. And then we have our big finale, and one that, oops, wrong way. One that we have mentioned before, Auld Lang Syne, alternate take. So Auld Lang Syne was recorded for the Christmas album finale, and that had a spoken outro from Dennis Wilson about, thank you for buying the album, we hope it brings you joy, that kind of thing. But the Beach Boys did an alternate version without Denny's vocals, and that was released for the first time here on the Rarities album. And this would be used on a lot of the Christmas collections to come. Unlike the Lord's Prayer, which is basically forgotten by Beach Boys fans, Auld Lang Syne, the non-Denny speaking version, the alternate version, is on a lot of releases. Some of the smaller Christmas ones, like Christmas Harmony, that's the only one they include. So I guess repurposing the outro from a Christmas album to be the outro here, probably a wise idea. And although it's nice to have it here, putting it right after this sexually charged live rocker is maybe a bit of an odd choice. Last thing to mention today, and this was from Brad Elliott's website, there was supposed to be one more song slotted onto the B-side, and that was to be kind of a tangential Beach Boys track. The little song called Pamela Jean that Brian Wilson produced for the Survivors. This would be later released to CD for pet projects. Car Crazy Cutie began as Pamela Jean. I guess they thought showcasing one of Brian Wilson's sort of Beach Boys songs would be a nice touch, but apparently this was legal wrangling to the point that the Capitol execs, or whoever was in charge, shut it down immediately. So it was not used, and indeed we'd have to wait till this CD to actually be able to get it, unless you had the original Survivors single. But it is a fun recording, and I think it would have fit in here as long as they put it by like Land Ahoy and some of the other early songs for the group. It's a fun rocker. The Fancy British singles collection does include it as the bonus single too. The Survivors, never really caught on. Most of Brian's side projects didn't. Brad Elliott mentioned that they found a lot of things like Honey's recordings and different like session takes and whatnot to consider for this album, but they ultimately did not use any of them. And he and his team, these were what they picked out and how they arranged it. So at the end of the day, a very random set, and nothing that's so rare you couldn't find it elsewhere if you were willing to look. But I can kind of see why Rarities didn't really catch on. It's a bit too random, and it doesn't flow perfectly well. It's more of a fun curio, a fun, collector's item from the day. Did you have this album? If you did, what'd you think of it? What are some of your favorite Beach Boys oddities and rarities? Please comment below, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.